Thanks everyone today for joining my session on Solution Architects to the Rescue. My name is Tom Bassett, and unsurprisingly, I am a solution architect. As well as this, I am an expert author for Salesforce Pen. I am an answers leader on the Trailblazer community. I co-lead the London Architect Community Group. I have my own YouTube channel with various content from developers to admins to flows. I have 23 traditional Trailhead certs, 1 Slack certification, and 11 partner certifications. So, I am going to attempt to convince you today that solution architects are trusted advisors that work with customers up to C-level to build out-of-this-world, super heroic Salesforce-powered solutions. So, the first lever in my toolkit to convince you of this is kind of breaking down what a solution architect is. And ultimately, I see this as a mashup of different roles. If I was creating a recipe to put in a cookbook or something like that, I would perhaps use one part admin, another part consultant and BA, another part developer, and also a dash of designer as well, because we all need to remember to think about the user experience and ultimately kind of what works for our users and what's going to drive adoption. So, as solution architects, what equips us to rescue? The first thing is we have kind of power, responsibility, and are trusted to bring systems together to create a source of truth. This is because we are senior members of the team. People look up to us. We should be mentor figures as well. And ultimately, with that comes the responsibility of making sure that your solution works in practice. We have technical know-how as well, and there are various different flavors of architects. I specialize more in B2B right now, but ultimately we are experienced in our clouds, products, features, and also industries as well. So that kind of backs up that technical knowledge too. We make strategic decisions, and certainly something I try to do is focus on what delivers the most value first for a customer. This helps to unlock ROI from MVP, or minimum viable product, and ensures that you kind of build trust with the customer and ultimately leads to, hopefully, mutual success as well. We aren't afraid to say no and push back. Sometimes you need to have the difficult conversations that people don't enjoy having. So we kind of have to play this escalation type role as well, and we'll cover that in a couple of slides' time. We're realistic when communicating with clients. If something isn't going to work out or it's not sustainable, then we aren't afraid to say so. We challenge and kind of work together to maybe think of a better solution or a different way of doing it. And we're kind of seasoned professionals as well, so we have years of experience and learn from our past experiences to ultimately deliver better solutions or better products in the future as well. So breaking down one of the skills that helps a solution architect to potentially rescue a situation, and maybe in this case, it's probably a potential situation before it's happened, is thinking about best practice. This is important to ensure that decisions are long-lasting and ultimately, everybody's kind of favorite buzzword, you aren't creating technical debt. So I've got a couple of examples here, some fictitious, some real, but to give you an idea of kind of best practices and how to apply them. The first one is if a customer needed the ability to track issues. Use cases for this. That's what it's designed for, right? Don't build a custom object and your own custom solution to do it. Look in terms of what is available on the platform readily and use that before building something custom. This is a real-life example here, but I once worked with a customer that had up to 50,000 transactions per day. And the key word in this kind of requirement is that the agents needed to report on them. They didn't need to edit them, transform them. They literally just needed to be able to see them. 50,000 transactions per day over a year. If you were storing that on platform, 18 million records, something you shouldn't really do. So we went with analytics instead. And ultimately, that met the requirement. And that way, the data was stored off platform, and we weren't worried about our storage limits. Another real-life example here, and you may need to squint to see this if you're at the back, but ultimately, working with a customer right now that wants to match leads to accounts. And originally, they came to me and said, I want this whenever an account is created or updated. And I worked with them to rein that in a little bit and determine what conditions the system was using to match accounts to leads, and then making sure that the automation was selective, so it didn't run all the time. It was only running where it was absolutely necessary. So in this case, when the website on the account was changed or the name on the account was changed, the automation would be kicked off. Another role that a technical solution architect often plays is as a technical escalation. I kind of hinted at this already, but sometimes we have to have the conversations that no one enjoys having. You have to have those difficult conversations with customers and solve a problem. The first example here is perhaps you're building something, it's a mature environment, there are other work streams happening, you're trying to deploy into a sandbox and you can't because somebody's introduced a validation rule, which is then meaning that your Apex tests are failing. So in that situation, you would need to work with the customer and any other third parties to kind of collaborate on the solution and determine what needs to be changed. Like, does my Apex need to be changed, or does the validation rule need to be changed? Another example, obviously, if you were adhering to DevOps best practices, you would perhaps avoid this type of situation, but a deployment wiping out changes. So ultimately, maybe somebody's working in a different environment and they've pushed something into another environment and it's wiped out, your page layout changes or whatever it is. Again, work with your customer to figure out what the problem is, how it happened, and perhaps, if it has happened, introduce kind of DevOps best practices and have a backup so it's not as big a problem in the future. And the last example here is new functionality hitting governor limits. Maybe you've built something, you developed it, and you've got it into a full sandbox, and you're now testing against realistic data volumes. Does happen. In this situation, slightly different, but you would probably need to focus on the business process or the requirement here to ensure that whatever's running is running kind of in a most restrictive way as possible, so it's not running all the time and it's grabbing records that it only needs, for example. So another skill in my toolkit, as I put it, is about being honest, because that is usually the best way. It builds trust, and that is really important when you're in my type of role for a partner and you're working with different customers. Without trust, the working relationship doesn't really have like great foundations. So it's important to have that, and the customer needs to trust you and you need to trust them. Finger pointing isn't helpful. It often leads to kind of aggressive or passive behaviors. So it's not beneficial really. And ultimately, instead of pointing the finger at who did what when, you could actually be fixing the problem instead. If you've made a mistake, own it. This is something that I do with my customers. They appreciate it a lot better. You just kind of own up and say, well, actually, I didn't think about that. Or, yeah, sorry, that's my bad. Or whatever it is. It goes down a lot better than kind of later on determining, maybe the customer finding out that it was something that you did that caused a problem. It's kind of an easier pill to swallow. Framing bad news with a potential solution as well is a great way of not only being honest, but kind of cushioning the blow with any potential problems. So you're not only telling them, okay, there's something wrong, there's something broken, you're kind of cushioning that on top with the fact that actually, and this is how we fixed it, or this is how we could fix it. Metaphors help with understanding as well. Sometimes I work with customers that aren't very technical. And for example, that flow-based scenario earlier that needed to run whenever an account was created or updated, simply kind of reverted to the customer and said, well, you wouldn't leave your cooker on all the time at home. Why are you leaving your automation on all the time? You shouldn't do it. It's a waste of energy. You're using unnecessary resources. And that way the customer got it, and we were on the same level and understood. Constructive feedback is a great tool as well in terms of being honest. And again, part of my role is kind of mentoring, coaching people. So this can help people to make better decisions in the future and maybe avoid an escalation or a problem in the first place. So, bringing me nicely on to embracing your inner mentor. We all have it in us, and I think quite straightforward point here, but act like the role model you'd like to be. You want to be approachable, you want to be open with people, you want to be honest, and if you aren't these things, people aren't going to go to you for help. They're going to go to somebody else. So it's important that you do this because as a solution architect, you could then potentially rescue a situation before it's even happened. When you're helping others, don't just think about the initial kind of need or problem. There's usually underneath, there's emotional needs, technical needs, and functional needs. So you're ultimately, a human being dealing with another human being, make sure you address all of their needs, not just the problem at hand. And coaching or training others, unsurprisingly, is a great way of being a mentor. If you learned something, share it with the team, and then in the future, they can apply those learnings too. And maybe a great example here of something that I've started to do recently, in team meetings, we actually ask each other now what went wrong this week. And that is kind of a way of turning a problem on its head and understanding, okay, I created an infinite loop in a flow. Whoops, like I'm not going to do that again. And I am sharing that with my colleagues and they're not going to do that again either. So it's just kind of that attitude ultimately is kind of the sense of maturity that I guess a solution architect brings to the situation. Actively listening is another great kind of lever in the toolkit as well. You want to care and show you care and ultimately understand. So you do this by shutting off distractions. If you're on a call with a customer, put yourself in do not disturb, make sure your phone's on silent, you're not going to be interrupted, and you are fully focusing on the situation, you are present as such. Maintain eye contact with people, in particular when you're talking to them in person. Obviously virtually, nigh impossible to do this, but I think it's another great tip. Being open, again, kind of reflects what I've said already, but it builds trust, and ultimately, that's the kind of foundation of any good working relationship. Pausing where necessary shows that you've kind of heard what they've said, you're processing it, and you're making kind of an informed decision before you go back. So you're not necessarily reverting with, okay, we'll build a flow or we'll do some Apex. You're actually thinking about it and the consequence of doing it in flow or Apex. Say it back as well. Just make sure that you're on the right page and ultimately you've understood and you're working together towards the same goal. Remaining mutual again discourages kind of passive or aggressive behaviors and make sure that you focus on the problem at hand. I have Samaritan's kind of shush listening tips quite close to my own heart, as that's where I started out as a Salesforce admin. So you can see almost what I've written here reflects those. If you want to, scan that QR code on screen now and you'll get a PDF copy of those shush listening tips. Cool, okay. So, thinking big picture is another way of rescuing a situation, or again, perhaps more so a potential situation here. But if you're doing something, what does it impact downstream? So I can kind of frame this as a mindset of if this, then that. So a great example would be if you're doing something in Sales Cloud and implementing account engagement is phase 2, what impact does that have on account engagement? Are you going to need to change something when account engagement, formerly Pardot, comes into play? Like, what is the consequence of what you're doing ultimately on something you're going to need to do in the future? What about when you build an integration? Do you have the necessary relationships, object model to support that? Do you have your external IDs set up for matching between different systems? That type of thing might be kind of an MVP plus thing. So when you're building MVP, maybe lay foundations to account for that or plan for it ultimately. Would sharing have to be adjusted for external users? So maybe you've implemented Service Cloud, phase 2 is going to be Experience Cloud. Do you have the relationships there between accounts and contacts to be able to share records like you're going to need to? Or does that need to change in order to kind of accommodate that? Another great example here is if you've got other systems in play, you've got kind of a more bigger like system architecture. What impact does this have on the data warehouse? If I clean up all my pick list values in Salesforce and forget to do it in the data warehouse, they're going to come back. Or my integration with the data warehouse is going to break. So kind of think kind of bigger picture there as well. And ultimately, how does this impact the bigger roadmap? So any of those other questions, think if you're taking on something additional or extra now, what does that mean for your timelines? Do your timelines have to change? Are you going to have to kind of push out a phase, or are you going to be able to do it within whatever's been agreed already? Okay. Another tip is being up to date. Hopefully, the majority of you know that Salesforce has 3 releases per year, and you can stay on track and up to date with these by attending the Salesforce Release Readiness live sessions that happen virtually through every release. You can attend user groups. I'm just going to plug my own London Architect user group here again. Consume content in a form that suits. So there's lots of content out there. There's videos, there's blogs, there's podcasts. Understand what works for you. And ultimately, if you're just listening to something in the morning while you're making your breakfast or something, you're consuming that content and learning. Reach out via the Trailblazer community if you are unsure of something. Review the release notes for your products, features, clouds, industries that you work in and kind of have an idea of what's coming. And get hands-on as well. That's another great way of kind of living and breathing these new features and functionalities too. So, unsurprisingly, sometimes you do need to come back to the user story. It's important to understand maybe when something's gone wrong, how it's gone wrong. A user story ultimately helps you define or understand the goals and objectives of a piece of functionality. So, by revisiting a user story when something hasn't gone quite as well as you'd hoped, you understand what was defined and how it was defined. Are the requirements actually being met? And is this an expanded or a new requirement? Perhaps it's taking on a new persona. Perhaps the user story only considered service agents, but now service managers have a problem because they can't get the reports they need or whatever it is. Is the user story kind of changing or evolving, and how do you adapt to that? Talking about personas, oh, there you go. By embodying personas, you're putting yourself in the shoes of your users. So a sales user persona would be focused on kind of pipeline tracking and meeting their targets. Whereas a marketing manager would probably be more focused on campaign attrition, attribution, and ultimately making sure they get a return on their investment. And then a service agent would have a completely different set of objectives and ultimately what they are looking to get out of the system. So by giving you these three examples, you can understand that there's overlaps and conflicts between the users, but ultimately by thinking like your users, you can hopefully kind of reduce these risks and these conflicts. So my last kind of tip here is about predicting the future. And for example, what happens to my custom flow that assigns permission sets and public groups when user access policies becomes generally available? That's now technical debt. What can I do to reduce the risk of that technical debt? Is there anything I can do now to kind of forward plan for it? What if the business grows rapidly? Am I going to have enough storage in the system? Am I going to hit API limits? Is the system going to be able to handle it? What if the company diversifies into a completely different line of business? Ultimately, am I going to need to build new processes to accommodate that? Or are my existing sales processes kind of rigid or flexible enough to kind of fit that in as well? What about in the future when I need to think about data retention and archiving? Ultimately, kind of how long is it before the system is potentially going to run out of space? Am I planning for this? Am I thinking about it? What about other trends like, for all of you marketers in the room, the trend to move to a cookie-less future? How am I planning for that? How am I ensuring that I'm still getting the tracking that I need for my prospects? And not everybody's favorite subject, but legal restrictions that could come into effect. GDPR has probably affected all of us in one way or the other, but how could we perhaps use those lessons to adapt maybe when GDPR changes or when something else like it comes into play? So I don't have any words to describe this because I think the image is powerful enough here. But in summary, you need to be more Ruth, and that's my own hashtag that I'm now hoping to get trending. But ultimately, Ruth, as I see it, she's a role model, she's trustworthy, she knows what she's talking about, she's confident, and she kind of acts as that trusted advisor in my mind. So that is kind of a great way to, I guess, embody her personality and her persona as a solution architect, or if you're working with a solution architect. So one last plug here to my user group. Scan the QR code on screen to be directed to our page and be able to sign up to these upcoming events. We've got an event coming up about architect careers, in particular the different flavors of architects. And we also have our super duper awesome meetup. And I think that's the last time they put me in charge of naming these things. But we're joining forces with the nonprofit user group, the Pardot user group, Marketing Cloud user group, and government user groups to come together and meet up. These tickets are very limited. I think the first one is now sold out in person, but we are doing hybrid events now. So if you missed out on an in-person ticket, you can put yourself on the waiting list and potentially sign up virtually instead. So that is the end of my session. I believe I have 1 minute. Okay. In that case, any questions on the app, and I will answer them, or feel free to find me around the event today as well. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Anthony from DSelect. And what is DSelect as a platform? It is essentially a way to enable marketers that use the Salesforce Marketing Cloud to get more out of their data. DSelect serves both non-technical marketers, for instance those who do not know how to write SQL queries, as well as technical marketers who are very well versed in the platform but who are looking for ways to be more efficient or who just want to enable their less technical colleagues. DSelect is an official Salesforce Marketing Cloud partner that offers the leading marketing data enablement platform on AppExchange. Fortune 500 leaders and mid-sized businesses leverage DSelect's intuitive solutions to help marketing teams create more powerful, segmented audiences, control marketing communication frequency, and achieve faster marketing cloud ROI without code or technical dependencies.